February 18th, 1942, a momentous day on the big island of Oahu, as an event which many, including Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, had deemed impossible, is actually underway. The once formidable battleship Nevada is afloat again after the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor 2 months prior. Despite being the only battleship to actually get underway during the assault, Nevada had suffered under the withering impact of multiple bomb hits and a devastating strike from a torpedo. As his ship sank out from underneath him and threatened to block the critical channel in and out of the harbour, Captain F.W. Scanland ordered the burning, sinking dreadnought to be beached. There she had sat for over 2 months, her shattered corpse propped up by the shallow seabed. During this time, though, scores of both Navy and civilian personnel made over 400 treacherous dives on her hull and had spent over 1,500 hours of work enduring horrendous conditions in a desperate struggle to salvage the powerful warship. 2 men had tragically lost their lives in the effort, and now, with her hull barely held above the water, she is gently shepherded into the hastily completed dry dock number 2. Men hold their breaths as the dead battle wagon creeps at an agonizingly slow pace through the gates. Each one of them knows that the Herculean effort that they have undertaken and the lives of their comrades lost along the way may all count for naught, because at any moment, any of the myriad of underwater patches and ad hoc repairs might fail and send the battleship crashing back down to the bottom and taking any hopes of recovery with it. But as the gates close and seal the behemoth in place, those in attendance are finally able to breathe a sigh of relief as they realize that all their hard work and sacrifice has paid off. Nevada will go on to fight again, but while that mighty battleship has been hauled out of her grave and given new life, many of her fleet mates still remain as stark and painful reminders of the immense struggle that lay ahead. There on the bottom rested Arizona, shattered and broken beyond hope. Just ahead of her, Oklahoma, the scene of a tragic struggle for life and death after the attack when she had rolled, trapping dozens inside. And further ahead still, the flagship of the Pacific Fleet, California, which had suffered badly and sunk, taking over 160 lives with her. As the American Navy engaged Japanese forces and clashed in epic battles, the salvage division of Pearl Harbor worked hard around the clock to bring these broken vessels back from the dead. Some, like Oklahoma, were too badly destroyed to be used again, but others, like California, would go on to bring the fight to the enemy that had sunk them and avenge their fleet mates. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Ocean Liner Designs, and this is part 3 of the astonishing true story of how they salvaged Pearl Harbor. As flagship of the US Pacific Fleet, USS California had been moored in berth F3 at the very front of Battleship Row, some distance away from her fleet mates, when the first Japanese planes buzzed in to begin their torpedo attacks that fateful December morning. While this distance afforded the battleship protection, should one of her comrades suffer a similarly catastrophic magazine detonation as the Arizona had, the berth far away meant that she was almost immediately singled out for destruction by the Japanese flyers. In the opening moments of the attack, at around 8:05 am, 2 torpedoes slammed into the port side of California below her impervious armor belt, the first striking forward near her bridge, while the second exploded further back almost directly under turret number 3. Both of these impacts ripped massive holes in the ship's hull and opened her up to the sea, but the flooding should have been stopped by a watertight subdivisioning. Bad luck stepped in to ensure that California sank. Most of California's extensive underwater protections and watertight compartments were rendered useless because the battleship had been left in what the Navy called Condition X-ray. Instituted in the lead up to an inspection, Condition X-ray stipulated that watertight compartments and manholes were to be left open to allow for easier navigation of the battleship's interior by senior officers and crew. But on the morning of December 7th, the men of California had little chance to transition their ship to a more secure condition, and so the battleship's critical internal defenses could not save her as she came under blistering air attack. Though California's crew had not been able to seal the battleship's watertight compartments, they had immediately rushed their battle stations, breaking out ammunition and heroically opening fire with 50 caliber machine guns and the ship's complement of 5-inch anti-aircraft guns. The men fought back valiantly against their attackers, hurling as much ordnance into the air as possible in a desperate attempt to save their ship, but for all their effort, the brave crewmen quickly found themselves running out of ammunition. The impacts from the torpedoes and the resulting flooding had knocked out California's power. The vast quantities of water rushing into her hull had contaminated the battleship's vast network of fuel lines that supplied her generators, and as a result, the hoists that supplied the topside 5-inch guns were soon out of action, leaving the topside gunners with almost nothing left to shoot at the seemingly endless formations of incoming Japanese bombers. It must have been intolerably frustrating because the crew had the guts and the guns to fight back, but they just didn't have the ammo. With the ship now listing dangerously to port, California's officers quickly issued orders to counter-flood in order to bring her back on something of an even keel. This quick thinking prevented California from capsizing completely in the immediate aftermath of the torpedo attack, but as fresh formations of bombers moved in, the ship and her men were not out of the woods. Roughly 25 minutes after the torpedo strike, California shuddered under the impact of several near misses from the bombers. These substantial explosions in the water right next to her buckled and bent the hull, causing even more uncontrollable flooding through the open compartments. But just after 8:45 AM, one of the Japanese bombs finally found its mark. The bomb, weighing over 1,700 pounds or just over 770 kilograms, and modified from a 16-inch naval shell, punched straight through California's deck amidships and exploded deep inside, killing 50 of her crew instantly and setting off one of her anti-aircraft ammunition magazines. The resulting fire spread rapidly, and the blaze was totally uncontrollable, since the loss of power had rendered the battleship's vast array of firefighting equipment inoperative and totally useless. California was out of the fight. During the desperate combat, scenes of incredible heroism had played out. 3 medals of honor would be awarded to California's crewmen in the aftermath of the attack, and tragically 2 would be awarded posthumously. Robert R. Scott, a machinist's mate in the forward air compressor room, refused to leave his battle station as a horrid amalgamation of churned up seawater and oil rapidly flooded the compartment that supplied vital compressed air to the 5-inch mounts. His comrades begged him to leave, but Scott refused, doggedly saying, "This is my station, and I'll stay and give them air as long as the guns are going," before the rising water eventually consumed him. Further back, Ensign Herbert C. Jones demonstrated remarkable courage, rescuing his fellow sailors from the noxious smoke filling California's corridors before taking over and directing fire from one of the ship's 5-inch anti-aircraft guns. As the flooding from the torpedo hits knocked out the power to the ammunition hoists, Jones wrangled together a group of men to manually haul the 55-pound, 25-kilogram shells out of the magazines themselves and up to the guns. The hit from the 1,700-pound armor-piercing bomb left him mortally wounded, and with fires spreading, Ensign Jones used his last breath to warn his comrades to keep away moments before the 5-inch ammunition magazine went up in a fireball. The only Medal of Honor recipient from California to survive the attack was gunner Jackson C. Farris. He'd been rushing to his position when one of the torpedoes impacted directly underneath, launching him right into the compartment's overhead ceiling. But despite being dazed and in severe pain, Farris worked desperately to pass ammunition to his gun, setting up another human chain to pass the ordnance up from the magazine. And when the order to counterflood came through, it was Farris who rallied his fellow sailors and directed them to make sure the orders were carried out. 2 times he was rendered unconscious by the choking fumes and the smoke, but each time he resumed his efforts to keep up the supply of ammo that was desperately needed topside, while he also braved the rapidly flooding compartments to save his shipmates. In those sort of conditions, inside claustrophobic steel compartments and rooms, every fibre of your being is screaming at you to get out and save yourself, but Farris and his comrades were able to keep their mind on the job and get it done, saving hundreds of lives in the process. Despite these men's gallant efforts, California was in dire straits, with fires spreading rapidly and her perforated hull flooding uncontrollably. Her men did what they could. But as if to make matters worse, from back along Battleship Row, a blazing inferno of burning fuel oil was steadily creeping its way along the surface of the water. Thick clouds of noxious black smoke billowed into the air and choked the brave men still left on California's deck as the flaming oil poured out of the ruptured hulls of the other stricken battleships and threatened to engulf them. With fires now all around, and their beloved ship sinking out from under them, the crew were forced to finally abandon California and make for the relative safety of Ford Island. The scene that greeted them must have been simply shocking, the sight of vast plumes of smoke filling the sky as they rose up from a sea of burning oil, while their fellow sailors desperately fought for their lives amidst the carnage. It would be forever ingrained in their minds. But there was little time to dwell on it. Hurriedly, the men gathered whatever firefighting equipment they could in a determined effort to save their own battered ship. But by the time they returned, California was already listing 8 degrees over, and the massive dreadnought gradually settled into the muddy harbour bottom and came to rest. Recovery of the California was going to be a big job. The ship had suffered even more substantial damage than Nevada had. The 2 torpedo holes in her hull, along with the buckling and rupturing from the near misses, meant that she could not just be patched and refloated. California had also sunk in deeper water than Nevada, nearly 40 feet or about 12 meters. It meant the water around California reached all the way up to her main deck, and her charred and blackened superstructure seemed to rise up from the water almost out of nowhere. The salvage teams were going to have to pull out all the stops in order to accomplish what to them must have seemed like a minor miracle. In the days and weeks after the attack, inspection had determined that the greatest threat to California's salvage was the water that was sitting over her hull and submerging her. In order to save the ship from the scrap heap, the men were going to have to hold Pearl Harbor itself at bay. And while that may have seemed like an impossible task, that's exactly what they set out to do. Lacking the time to raise her properly up, engineers devised a clever solution. Using 4-inch thick wooden boards and sturdy angle iron, massive cofferdams were constructed around California's hull. Anchored to her shear line, that is, the curve along the top edge of the ship's hull, the dam in effect served as a vertical extension of the hull itself, like a wooden wall that jutted up and kept water off the deck. 2 of these impressive structures were built, one for the stern section, while another, possibly more important cofferdam enclosed her forepeak at the bow, which had been blown open by one of the near misses. Though impressive, the cofferdams presented challenges of their own. The first problem was that the wood itself was inherently buoyant, and bolting large slabs of it to the side of a sunken battleship was not an easy task, especially when you consider that the divers tasked with installing them were encumbered by clumsy helmet diving suits, covered in thick oil that still sheened on the surface of the harbour. Secondly, it was feared that as pumping efforts began to dewater the decks, the surrounding seawater would press inward now against the unsupported inside of the cofferdams and collapse the entire structure from the outside, flooding California once again and leading to even further damage. To combat this, a series of heavy-duty timber braces, similar to the kind used to shore up ships waiting to be launched on the slipway, were added to the interior walls of the dams that would hold back the immense pressure of the water from the outside. Once the cofferdams were in place, pumping began, the clearing of California's decks having the combined effect of lightening the ship and revealing the damage done to her top side during the attack. With her decks finally free of water, divers could turn their attention to the crippled giant's ravaged hull. It was quickly discovered that the California couldn't simply have her watertight compartments sealed and the water pumped out, as had been done with Nevada. The combined damage to her bow section below the waterline from the torpedo and the near-miss bomb was considerable, with a near 40-foot, 12-meter long, and in places 10-foot tall gash being blasted out of the side of the ship. With the option to simply button her up and pump out the water not being viable, and with the immense success of the cofferdam solution, it was decided to carry over the principle of the topside structures into the new versions of the underwater patches that had failed to work with Nevada. Like oversized bandages placed over massive wounds, these new patches were constructed from the same 4-inch thick wood planks and angle iron that had been used topside. Each of the 16-foot sections of timbering had to be curved at the bottom perfectly to account for the shape of California's hull near her bilge section, while the tops extended well above the ship's waterline. Massive floating cranes were used to carry the patches over from Pearl Harbor's coal dock, where a team of skilled carpenters worked tirelessly. The structures were then lowered down against California's side and sunk using heavy lead weights to counteract the wood's natural buoyancy, before finally being bolted to the crippled warship's hull. The act of bolting a wooden patch onto a battleship proved to be a monumental task in and of itself, since divers were first tasked with cutting away twisted bits of metal rent apart by the force of the explosions before, and then drilling holes into the ship's side into which they would mount the heavy-duty bolts needed to support the patch's immense weight. But the divers' struggle did not end there. Once the bolts were inserted, they would have to traverse the flooded, labyrinthine corridors of the battleship's interior to place a similar heavy-duty nut on the other end of the bolt threads and screw it shut to properly hold the patch against the hull. It was a very daunting job. California's cramped and winding passages stretched pitch black, apart from what scant illumination the gallant men's lights could provide. The danger of this task is difficult to overstate, and so is the bravery of the men who carried it out. But for these men, the notion of simply leaving the ship sunk in the mud or breaking her up for scrap was just too much to bear. California and the other battleships stationed at Pearl Harbor on December 7th were cherished vessels, their presence instilling a sense of deep pride in all the servicemen of the Pacific Fleet. To see them in such a state, burnt out, bent, broken, and sunk, filled each man with an indomitable will to do whatever it would take to bring them back, and they pressed onward. To ensure that the patches would adequately shore up California's hull before the refloating, gaps between the timber and the steel hull had to be made watertight. The nut and bolt arrangement wasn't good enough. Here again, another ingenious solution was implemented. To seal the patches, long, thin canvas sacks filled with oakum, a hemp or jute fibre soaked in pitch, were pressed into the gaps. Once packed full and soaked in water, the pliable material was referred to as pudding, thanks to its malleability, although some men joked that the puddings more closely resembled sausages. But regardless, after being wedged in between the hull and the timber, the weight of the water that had earlier threatened the viability of the cofferdam solution in the first place now actually worked for the salvage team, since it pressed the oakum sacks firmly enough into the gaps to form a very effective watertight seal. Admiral William Furlong, impressed with the creative solution, compared it to a mason jar's rubber gasket. With the great patches finally bolted in place and the canvas and oakum puddings sealing the gaps, divers were once more called on to brace the interior face of each patch, similar to what had been done on the cofferdams above. Like with those, it was feared that once the water was pumped out of California's hull, the weight of the water on the outside would cave in the wood keeping her afloat and send the dreadnought crashing right back down to the bottom. And so, once again, the brave men were called upon to traverse California's flooded interiors, only this time dragging along cumbersome timbers and heavy steel bracing along with all the tools and equipment required to actually build the bracing to keep the patches intact. With the patches braced and the cofferdams keeping the sea at bay, the colossal floating cranes were used to remove every major heavy bit of equipment that could be taken off to lighten the load. The battleship's huge main armament, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and even her towering basket masts. It was all taken off in an effort to lighten the lumbering monster as much as possible before attempting to refloat her. Finally, on the 21st of March, after 4 months of exhausting, grueling, and dangerous work, the pumps were turned on and California, the flagship of the Pacific battleship fleet, began to rise from her muddy grave. But almost immediately, there were problems. See, California hadn't only sunk in deeper water than Nevada, she'd also gone down on an uneven patch of sea floor. This meant that as water was pumped out and the ship began to lighten, the irregular positioning caused her to develop at one point a terrifying 20-degree list. It took 3 agonizing days for California to come up from the bottom, with pumping continuing all the way until April 5th, and that's when the unthinkable happened. At around 1:15 PM, with California once again floating, finally, and waiting for a dry dock to open up, another explosion rocked the ship. With a thunderous boom, the massive bow patch over the near-miss bomb damage blew out. Thousands of tons of seawater reflooded the spaces that the men had worked so hard to restore. The ship lurched under the added weight, and her bow dipped alarmingly back down into the water. Immediately, the men aboard sprung into action, rigging up 2 pumps and shutting as many doors and watertight hatches as they could. Their quick thinking saved California, as the water ingress from the loss of the bow patch would have been enough to put her back on the bottom in minutes. But with the pumps running and the hatches and doors closed, California stayed afloat, and crucially, at a shallow enough draft to actually make it into the dry dock, a fact which saved the poor divers from having to perform another miracle. With the ship saved, everyone's thoughts immediately turned to what had just happened. Of course, sabotage was immediately suspected. Pearl Harbor and the Pacific Fleet's battleships were still prime targets for the Japanese, and even before the war had started, it was feared that Hawaii's significant population of ethnic Japanese would side with their ancestral homeland in the event of war, and would either spy or commit acts of sabotage. And now, with the significant explosion aboard California, it appeared that those fears might have some merit. But after a thorough investigation, no evidence of sabotage or any kind of explosive compounds were discovered. What was found, though, was that large amounts of fuel oil vapour, along with a high concentration of hydrogen sulfide, a gas generated from all the decomposing food, paper and other organic materials, had created an extremely volatile mixture that had somehow found an ignition source and erupted into an explosion powerful enough to mangle deck beams and damage bulkheads. The salvage team got lucky, as even with the patch blown out, California's forward compartments now flooded again, the battleship was just barely light enough to clear the entrance to the dry dock. At last, on April 9th, 1942, USS California was gently towed into dry dock number 2. The 2 pumps still attached to her deck were gushing water as they strained to keep the indomitable giant's bow afloat. With the gates closed behind her and the water steadily pumping out, crews descended on the battleship to prepare her for the long voyage back to the United States. Like with Nevada, the interior of California was a scene of indescribable filth and ruin. During the initial salvage, over 200,000 gallons, or some 757,000 litres of fuel oil, had been siphoned out of her, but despite this incredible volume having already been removed, the oil still clung to every surface from the third deck up, and below that, thick, gluey mud had cemented itself in and around the bomb and torpedo damage. Heaps of decomposing food, paper, clothing, and bodies all had to be removed. The mess inside California was so bad, in fact, that after 4 months of grueling work performed by hundreds of men, only about half of the ship had been reclaimed from the filth. There were also all the human touches of life from before the tragedy as well. A band member, L.B. Lukenbach, had taken his sheet music aboard but was forced to evacuate the stricken ship as the attack went on. Now, all these months later, Lukenbach, who was lucky to have survived, was able to go aboard and find it. Poignantly, one of the sheets was the score for the Stars and Stripes Forever. As the muck was finally cleared away, scores of metal workers turned their attention to the battleship's ruptured hull. Twisted and bent steel plating was cut away to make way for new sections to be welded in place. Beams were removed, straightened, and then reinstalled. It was found that much of California's damaged hull plating could simply be heated, rolled back into shape, and then reattached. While this work was performed, the extensive topside damage was repaired as well, with the many holes in California's deck and superstructure being patched over with new plating. But not all of this work that needed doing was going to be straightforward. Unlike Nevada, California used a turbo-electric propulsion system. Where Nevada used the steam generated in her 12 massive boilers to drive turbines geared to her propeller shafts, California relied on steam-driven turbines generating electricity for an impressive set of 4 electric motors to push her immense bulk through the water. And being submerged in Pearl Harbor's briny water for several months hadn't done them any favours. But under the supervision and guidance of representatives from General Electric, 2 of the massive motors were removed and completely rewound. Miles of copper wire had to be carefully spooled in order to provide the dreadnought with enough of its own power to limp its way across the Pacific back to Puget Sound, Washington, where the rest of her machinery could be overhauled. This massive effort in rebuilding California's beating heart was described by the men from General Electric as the largest job of this sort ever performed in the field. While all of this was going on, dockyard workers set to work stripping the battleship's interior down to almost nothing. Furniture and fittings were removed, along with the ship's ventilation equipment, while every ounce of wiring was ripped out to make way for newer, more up-to-date systems and switchboards. Compartments, which had been stripped down to bare metal during cleaning operations, were now repainted and restored. And finally, on the 7th of June 1942, USS California left the dry docks at Pearl Harbor on her way to mainland USA to complete repairs and refit, the Revenant battleship departing Pearl on October 10th after being reunited with her main 14-inch battery. It must have been an emotional sight for the hundreds of men and women who'd made it happen. There was California in a coat of fresh blue paint steaming out for the open ocean, a true moment of pride for the teams that had worked day and night to bring this mighty warship back from the dead. But few newsreels chatted as California made her way out of Pearl Harbor. The departure had to be strictly secret, lest Japanese submarines or aircraft intercept her en route and send her back to the bottom. Steaming once more under her own power, California arrived back in the US to undergo permanent repairs and receive a huge refit and entire overhaul. When she emerged from dry dock in January 1944, the once aging dreadnought was now a lethal and modernised warship. Sporting a new dazzle paint scheme, California bristled with 40 brand new Bofors anti-aircraft cannons and just as many 20mm Oerlikon guns as well. She was stripped of her outdated basket masts and also had her armour increased, turning her into a veritable floating fortress. Returning to the fleet in May that year, California would go on to deal out healthy servings of revenge, unleashing her fury on the Japanese forces at Saipan, Guam, and Tinian. But this would not be all, as on October 24th, 1944, USS California would have the distinct honour of joining her fellow Pearl Harbor revenants Maryland, West Virginia, and Tennessee, along with the New Mexico-class battleship Mississippi, at the Battle of Surigao Strait. This task force laid waste to their opponents, sinking the Japanese battleships Fuso and Yamashiro, along with the destroyers Michishio, Asagumo, and Yamagumo. California's guns roared and sent over 60 big shells downrange, crippling Yamashiro. Meanwhile, Mississippi's salvo would prove to be the last time one battleship would ever fire at another in anger. But California would not emerge from the war unscathed. On January 6, 1945, while supporting the invasion of the Philippines, she was struck by a kamikaze, the resulting explosion killing 44 of her men and injuring another 155. The damage required her to return to the United States once more for repairs, but she still wasn't done. The old battleship returned just in time to participate in the end of the Okinawa campaign. She'd go on to support the American occupation of Japan in the wake of the Empire's surrender. The much-revered battle wagon sailed into the home waters of the enemy that had once crippled her, now stronger and more deadly than ever. It had been a triumphant end, but while California would finish the war on a high, the same, sadly, cannot be said for the remaining battleships of the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. So far, all the battleships had been returned to service, but once California was gone, what remained was essentially a graveyard of overturned and shattered warships. At Battleship Row, the upturned hull of the Oklahoma sat conspicuously in view as the men toiled away on the other ships. The side of her propellers sticking helplessly out of the water, while her superstructure lay smashed against the harbour bottom, was a stark and painful reminder of what had happened on the day of infamy. Hers would be the largest and the most difficult salvage of them all, and the effort would require the skills and expertise of some of America's best and brightest engineers. On the morning of the attack, Oklahoma had gone to battle stations, just like the others around her, her men racing topside, breaking out 5-inch shells and belts of 50 caliber ammunition. She'd fought back valiantly at first, but she was astride of Maryland on the outer mooring, and her long, thick hull presented a perfect target for Japanese Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers. Almost immediately, a heavy barrage of torpedoes smashed into her side, ripping her armoured hull apart like wrapping paper. In fact, the exact number of torpedoes that struck the Oklahoma has never been definitely verified, but it's thought that between 5 and 7 torpedoes struck during just the opening moments of the attack. It was an unprecedented, devastating blow. Almost immediately, Oklahoma took on a massive list as water thundered into her broken hull. Within minutes, the battleship had heeled way over to a frightening 35 degrees and continued to slip further and further. It was quickly becoming obvious that the mighty warship just wasn't coming back, and the order to abandon her was promptly issued and passed to the crew as they desperately scrambled out of hatches and gun ports to escape the rapidly advancing flooding. Men poured over the rolling side of the battleship, plunging into the water, and some swam to the safety of Ford Island, while many made for the Maryland moored alongside to assist her gunners in the fight against the marauding Japanese aircraft that still filled the sky. Those who landed on the island quickly set up a collection point for casualties, and sent those who arrived uninjured to help in putting out the rapidly spreading oil fires. But as her superstructure settled into the mud, more than 450 crewmen found themselves trapped within the upturned hull, fumbling around in the pitch dark as a horrid mix of water and spilled oil quickly overtook the few remaining air pockets. Frantically, the men picked up whatever they could, desperately banging on the battleship's hull with wrenches and hammers, tapping out SOS signals in a last-ditch attempt to call for help. Stuck inside the sunken hull, the men trapped had no way of knowing if rescuers had heard their SOS at all, and without a way to effectively talk with the outside world, they were forced to sit in the choking darkness and wait. But as it turned out, someone had heard. Julio de Castro, a civilian working at Pearl Harbor's naval yard, heard the sounds of clanging from within the capsized hulls. Knowing this could only mean one thing, he quickly gathered his fellow yard workers and set about trying to open up the Oklahoma's hull to free the trapped sailors. Working with Commander E.P. Cransfelder from the Maryland, who had managed to find a booklet of general plans for the two near-identical sister ships, De Castro and his team worked with pneumatically powered chipping tools fitted with heavy-duty chisels to break into the capsized hull. De Castro and his men worked through the night, the still-burning Arizona lighting up their work area as they desperately toiled to rescue as many men as possible before their oxygen ran out. After hours of backbreaking work, one by one, the beleaguered sailors of Oklahoma that could be reached were pulled out of their would-be tomb. When one of these sailors told De Castro that several men were trapped in an adjacent compartment, the yard worker simply replied, "We'll get 'em out." For an hour, fellow dockyard worker Joe Bulgo worked on the bulkhead in the rising water. He made 3 cuts before calling out, "Look out for your hands, boys!" And then he set about smashing the wall the rest of the way down with a sledgehammer, freeing 10 more men. All in all, 32 of Oklahoma's trapped sailors were rescued by De Castro and his brave crew of yardsmen. It had been a magnificent, heroic effort, but tragically, for hundreds more men, the battleship would be their tomb. Its upturned hull serving as a giant steel sarcophagus, but not a permanent one. In the wake of the rescue attempt, attention eventually had to be turned to the ship itself. It was clear that Oklahoma was in a very sorry state, though the full extent of the carnage was unknown since her damaged sections were largely inaccessible, thanks to either being blocked by the ship itself or buried in the mud. With her hulk resting firmly on the bottom, salvage teams left Oklahoma to rest for the time being. There was little hope that the old girl would ever see service again, and with California and Nevada providing far more hopeful prospects for salvage, workers' efforts and Pearl Harbor's limited resources were committed to see these ships restored instead. But with her corpse occupying a valuable berth on Battleship Row, and a sunken superstructure representing a navigational hazard to any ship traversing the channel, by mid-1942 the decision was finally made to right her. Getting Oklahoma onto an even keel was an even greater undertaking than the salvage of either California or Nevada, and once more the skilled men of the Pacific Bridge Company were vital in its success. It was immediately obvious that the previous solutions of cofferdams, patches and pumps employed on both California and Nevada were woefully insufficient to lift Oklahoma's bulk off the bottom. The battleship was effectively upside down. She'd need to be put right first before any attempt at refloating could be done. But just how on earth do you right a 27,500-ton, 583-foot-long ship stuck in the mud? Well, the brilliant minds of the Pacific Bridge Company got to work, and their expertise devised a spectacular system that would see Oklahoma pulled right side up. It involved a series of 21 massive righting frames, each attached to the exposed portion of the hull. Heavy-duty steel cables were run across to the conveniently nearby Ford Island, where they connected to an array of staggeringly powerful winches using electric motors taken from the tram cars in Honolulu. In theory, as the winches got to work, the cables would slowly be wound up, lifting Oklahoma's exposed side over and righting the ship. But with over 27,000 tons of steel to shift, it was a very dicey proposition. To ease at least some of the strain on the whole arrangement, as much fuel and ammunition as possible was removed from Oklahoma, while divers ventured inside the wreck to close as many doors and hatches as they could, to allow air to be pumped into undamaged sections and create pockets that would lighten the ship even more. Thousands of tons of crushed coral was even placed under Oklahoma's bow to provide something for the ship to roll against as she was righted, since her bow had gone down in a patch of the same sort of soft mud that had complicated the salvage of the California. With the system designed and set up within months, on March 8, 1943, the winches were switched on, and ever so slowly, the once mighty dreadnought was hoisted upright. It looked, from the air, like a toy battleship half sunk in a pond, but the reality was that this full-sized, massive battleship was being lifted upright by the clever system of winches and cables that had been custom designed for the job. The only thing was that progress was painfully slow. The lifting operation would continue all the way from March until mid-June, with pauses being taken to re-rig cables and make adjustments and repairs as necessary. And as the battleship slowly crept its way onto an even keel, the catastrophic extent of the damage was gradually revealed. Once more, a series of huge patches were constructed to seal the rent-open hull, while large air-filled pontoons were strapped to her sides to aid her buoyancy. The lessons learned from all the previous salvages proved invaluable, as the now experienced teams set to work refloating the battered warship. At last, in mid-June 1942, they'd done it. Oklahoma was upright and afloat. It had been an engineering triumph, but it still presented a tragic sight. The once proud battleship reduced to little more than a dented, rusted hulk, but the job had been done. Now she needed to be stripped and repaired, and the remains of her crew had to be found and properly interred. Oklahoma would slip into Dry Dock 2 on December 28, 1943, her broken hull just barely clearing the entrance. Here, crews set about sealing up the rents in her hull, cutting away mangled steel and replacing it with welded plates to make her watertight once again. Cleaning crews again began the unenviable task of removing the by now all too familiar buildup of rotten sludge and oil coating every inch of her interior, but as they worked, they uncovered the exposed bones of more than 400 of their fallen comrades, their bodies fully decomposed after a year and a half underwater. This grueling, nightmarish task was only lightened by the knowledge that Oklahoma did not have to be as thoroughly cleaned as the others, since she was by now well and truly destined for the scrappers. Hundreds and hundreds of tons of machinery were stripped out of her. Boilers, computers, generators, guns, engines, almost her entire superstructure. By the end, all that was left was a bare hull dotted with 4 big gunless turrets. With her hull patched up, Oklahoma would sit out the rest of the war in Pearl, the once indomitable warship waiting her turn for the scrapyard. In 1946, she was finally sold to a shipbreaking firm, but a year later, while under tow to San Francisco to meet her fate, Oklahoma took matters into her own hands. During a storm, the dreadnought broke her tow lines and sank, plunging into the cold, crushing depths of the Pacific, and her location remains a mystery to this day. The righting of the Oklahoma had represented the largest and most complex salvage the team faced during their efforts at Pearl Harbor. With the hulk now removed and set aside, Battleship Row was once again clear, and only the shattered wreck of the exploded Arizona remained where she had dramatically gone up. And with the main channel again clear, ships could once more freely come in and out of Pearl without fear of striking the submerged remains of the once mighty dreadnoughts. But, even with this monumental undertaking now behind them, a handful of smaller but still important ships remained waiting for them. On the other side of Battleship Row was Utah, the gunnery training ship, which had rolled just like Oklahoma had. Armed with the skills and lessons from raising that ship, the salvage division would turn their attention to Utah, but results would not be quite so successful. And of course, there was Arizona, the ship that would go on to symbolize the devastating attack in and of itself. In part 4 of this series, we'll explore this final chapter and the incredible effort that it took to salvage Pearl Harbor.